One of the very first video ideas I had when I thought about starting this channel was analyzing the games that I've played for more than 100 hours, and looking at what connects them. What about these games makes me play them for so long? Now, I know for some people that is not an impressive amount of time, and for others it's an obscene amount of time. For me, the way I play games is usually variety first. I tend to play a lot of games for shorter amounts of time, rather than dumping a ton of hours into a single game. Truth be told, I don't know if this video will end up being all that interesting. The topic is interesting to me, but I don't know if I'll make any interesting discoveries along the way, or if the answers will all end up being obvious. But I hope you join me as I work it all out. So finally capping off this 3-part series about game length and scope, let's look at some big ol' games. Though as I finish up this third video, I realize it isn't really the length and scope of the games I'm talking about, but far more of an analysis on my own playstyles and habits. I'll throw a list of all the games and how much time I've spent in each of them in the description so you can reference it at any point, in case it's something you care about. Without further ado, let's go. The first thing I noticed is fairly obvious. My favorite multiplayer games have well over 100 hours. This makes a lot of sense. These games are designed to easily spend hundreds of hours in. I'd briefly mention this in my video on short games, but competitive multiplayer games are fun because the core gameplay loop is fairly contained and, assuming you enjoy that core loop, basically infinitely repeatable. The game itself stays the same, but the experience of playing it is different every round as you spend time honing your skills, perfecting your craft, and facing off against new people, all as the competitive meta changes. A lot of this time can be spent on my own and I'll still have a good time. But where the vast majority of these hours come in is when I'm playing with or against my friends. And when this happens, it's far more about hanging out with my friends than actually playing a game. I'm never really going to spend 4 straight hours playing a game on my own, but if I'm online with my friends, the time starts to become irrelevant. The summer that Valorant came out, me and the boys spent almost every single evening playing the game for hours and grinding out the battle pass. When Sea of Thieves came out, I think I spent legitimately 13 straight hours playing with one of my best friends, with only a very brief break for dinner. Good company is ultimately the biggest factor in my massive hour counts for a lot of these games, but even without these friends, I could still easily have spent a good chunk of time in games like Rocket League, Sea of Thieves, or Valorant. And I have. And in fact, I have quite a few games that I have majoritively played by myself. I've spent a lot of time on the solo grind for a handful of Smash games and the Splatoon games. Smash has a fair bit of local multiplayer to account for, but most of those hours were me just trying to get good. Splatoon especially, having about 300 hours between the first 2 games, is really just because that core gameplay is incredibly addictive and surprisingly deep and complex. There is a lot of room for real competitive play here, and it easily lends itself to hundreds and hundreds of hours of play. Unfortunately, I think my energy has run out for this series a bit. I've dropped a measly 20 hours into Splatoon 3 in the last few months, and it's a fantastic game, but after having finished the single player, I just don't have another 100 hours of Splatoon left in me right now. But over the years, I will probably build up to it in this title as well. I mentioned Sea of Thieves just a moment ago, but I want to elaborate a little bit more on collaborative multiplayer games. Sea of Thieves at 616 hours and Monster Hunter World at 238 are my 2 big ones. Again, good company is a major driving factor behind the hefty playtimes here, but it's also incredibly rewarding to be working towards shared goals with other people. In these games, you all share some major long-term goals, and you can set short-term personal goals for yourself. Maybe you want to buy a new outfit in Sea of Thieves and you need cash, or maybe you need some specific monster parts for a weapon in Monster Hunter. These are immediate, short-term goals that can be accomplished in a session or 2. But at the same time, you're all trying to raise your hunter rank, progress the story, or in Sea of Thieves, you are aiming for Pirate Legend. Most everything you do in the game will be useful to you in some way, so you can help out your friends with their personal goals, and it will still be useful towards your own main end goal. This give and take of helping your friends out is incredibly satisfying both as a game mechanic and intrapersonally. It's fun to set out on a hunt with a friend who is desperately hunting a rare part for their specific build. These games can also be a real slog on your own, so the emphasis on group assistance not only makes them fun, but is almost essential to having the best experience with the game. Before I move on, here are the multiplayer games that I've hit the big 100 in, most of which I haven't talked about just because they're pretty self-explanatory. The next category here is also fairly easy to explain. Games I've played multiple times. These games are on screen now, hopefully. So yeah, obviously if you replay a 60-hour game like Fire Emblem Three Houses or Xenoblade Chronicles, you will hit 100 hours pretty easily. But what is it about these specific few games that made me want to replay them despite that kind of commitment? This section is more interesting than the last though, because we get to look more closely at more individual games, the first of which will be some Fire Emblem games. I've played Three Houses for 155 hours because it has 4 different story routes to explore, each landing in at a 45 to 60 hour range. Having played the DLC and the 3 main stories, yeah, obviously I've spent a lot of time here. By the 3rd playthrough, I've grown pretty weary of the game though, and I don't see myself going back in for number 4 for a good long while. I loved the game to death on my first playthrough, but the tedium of trying to experience everything it has to offer has really soured me on it. Fire Emblem Fates, with 111 hours, is in a similar boat with the 3 separate stories to experience, and while it isn't as good as Three Houses, I remember it more fondly and just didn't get sick of it the same way. Fire Emblem Awakening at 116 hours is interesting though, as there is only one story to play, and yet I've replayed it 3, 4, maybe even 5 times. The first 2 are easily explained. The core gameplay of Fire Emblem is tactically satisfying and fairly repeatable, so it wasn't hard to convince me to play again to get a new angle on the story. But why did I play Awakening 4 times? The answer lies far more within myself and the time at which I played the game than the game itself. Sure, Fire Emblem does have very engaging gameplay. The characters are delightful and there's plenty to do, but Fire Emblem Awakening was my first Fire Emblem game, and one of my first more niche titles that wasn't really marketed towards the casual audience. I didn't even realize this kind of game existed. I got the game on my 13th birthday and I was enthralled by the world before me. I fell in love with the characters and the story and the intricacies of its gameplay. And after probably spending around 40 hours on my first run, I jumped back in immediately for another. And then somewhere over the next few years, I played it over again, and again, and maybe even a 5th time? The game itself is great, but the time I spent in it wouldn't be replicable today. So much of that time is due to my youth and newfound excitement for the hobby. I also kind of had fuck else to do at 13 years old, so that's definitely part of it. The same scenario applies to Skyward Sword. This was the first real game I played, the biggest, longest game I had played at that point. Skyward Sword was the first time I really explored a full 3D world, entrenched myself in an epic story, fought big bosses and found treasure. I played the game for 40 to 50 hours the first time and immediately replayed it. Over the next few years, I played it once or twice more, and then I replayed it again when the HD remaster came out on Switch. My stories with Skyward Sword and Awakening are nearly identical scenarios, and the Fire Emblem experience only happened maybe a year or 2 after my introduction to Skyward Sword, and the same thing also happened with Pokemon Platinum when I was, 7? So a lot of the games in this category are here because I experienced them in some of my most formative years, when I had little else to do or worry about, and was still young enough to be entertained by the same experience over and over. Xenoblade Chronicles is the only game in the last 5 years that I've replayed enough to hit 100 hours. And again, this is a little bit of a cop-out because of the definitive edition on Nintendo Switch. I played the original in the summer of 2017 before Xenoblade 2 came out, but didn't quite finish it. I played Xenoblade Chronicles for the first time summer of 2017 before getting interrupted by Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and then finishing the game after 2 in 2018. I probably spent a good 60 to 70 hours on that first run, and it's a pretty chunky game on its own. Then in 2020, when the definitive edition released, I played the game again, and a little bit faster, but still enough to break 100 total hours across both versions. The re-release is again similar enough that I'm going to count them as one game here. Given that they're so similar though, what called me to replay it? I had plenty of other games to play at the time and had already experienced the story, and I returned to this one knowing it would be a full 50-hour commitment. And you know what they say about me and commitment? Can't do it. I can't do it.
Talk all you want, because those words will be your last!
The answer is very simple. I love that game. All of the Xenoblade games are complete comfort games to me, but one especially holds a place in my heart because of the atmosphere of that world. And while it is a flavor of nostalgia, it wasn't even my first Xenoblade game. Having played X in 2016 and then 2 in the middle, it's the 3rd one I beat. But when I think of Xenoblade Chronicles, of those characters, of Colony 9 and its residents, the awesome serenity of the Bionis, it all just feels like home. And especially given the events of early 2020, that was a feeling I desperately needed to have. That said, I would have totally picked it up again because the visual overhaul was pretty significant, and the epilogue, while in retrospect a bit disappointing, was too tantalizing to resist. Adding in a note here, I went back and double-checked my play count on Xenoblade 1 after having written this script. Apparently I had 93 hours on my first playthrough, which is damn close to 100 already. My point still stands though about replaying it, but everything I'm about to say in the next section I guess also applies to that. Anyway, let's move on to the real meat of this video. Games I've spent over 100 hours on in a single save file. This last section is perhaps the most interesting because there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer for all of the games. For the most part, they each have unique reasons for joining the 100-hour club. The first games I'd like to talk about are sim games, namely Animal Crossing New Horizons and Stardew Valley. I'm also going to throw New Leaf on the pile here because it's sitting at like 96 hours, it's close enough. In general, sim games like this make sense on paper. The games usually don't have a real end goal and can be played endlessly, which lends itself well to long hours. But in practice, I end up dropping most of these games before spending too much time with them, because I find they can get a bit stale, or it's just a big commitment, like I was talking about in the survival games section in my I Have Commitment Issues video, but Animal Crossing is a little different. New Leaf was there for me at my lowest, and I will always look back fondly on it. I would have played even more of it if I knew about all of the things you could unlock and do, but my island is woefully boring, and I didn't know about a lot of the major features. I was content with the simple stuff though, and it's pretty impressive I played it as much as I did considering. It was another one of those major games that really formed my tastes as I was just beginning to get into gaming. So it didn't even occur to me that there was so much I didn't know about. I never looked at a guide or a video or anything. I just lived in that isolated little world and it was perfect. Sometimes I would boot up the game just to sit on a bench and stare at the sky while the music hums softly in the background. The 11 p.m. theme is a deeply important piece of music to me. I remember several nights when I would curl up in my bed, change my 3DS clock to 11, and then play some Animal Crossing, no matter what time it actually was. This simple melody gave me some hope, but it also allowed me to wallow in melancholy in a bizarrely comforting way that I think everybody just kind of needs in middle school. New Horizons, however, is an entirely different story. Everything about this game was the perfect storm. Releasing in March 2020, the game was there when there was truly fuck all else to do. I played it every single day for at least 2 months after launch, and then very regularly for the remainder of that first year. The game started off a little bare bones, not as big of a problem as I think some people make it out to be, but it was missing some major staples from New Leaf. But the amount of customization the game offers totally makes up for it. Having so much minute control over your island is a recipe for wasting hours and hours away crafting the perfect place to escape to. I have 205 hours in New Horizons, and most of those are from the first year and a half, but then, well, I think I've mentioned this before on the channel, I accidentally wiped my Switch saves when I was moving over to my OLED. Complicated story, whole mess. I'll save it for another time maybe. Point is, I had to restart about a year ago, and initially I was crushed, absolutely just devastated. But then I had a really good time replaying the game as the 2.0 update came out, but unfortunately most of that content is actually locked behind endgame requirements, and I never really got to most of it. I did beat the game again, so I have replayed this game, but I had well over 100 hours on the first run, so I'm still counting it here, and that number is surely going to grow. Stardew Valley is also a bit of a cheat because I have 90 hours on my Switch save and then 31 on a different multiplayer save on PC, but 90 is so close that I feel silly putting it in the last category. Anyway, Stardew Valley is another fantastic escape. It's also significantly more complex than Animal Crossing. It totally scratches an itch in my brain that just won't be satisfied by the simplicity of Animal Crossing. Stardew Valley is also a superb multiplayer game, and I can see myself playing this game absolutely forever. Like just literally until the end of time, I will always be playing Stardew. The next 3 games fall into the open world category, but I've spent the time with them for very different reasons. Starting chronologically, Xenoblade X is the first of 3 I passed 100 hours in. The game's story is pretty lengthy as it is, so it's not all that surprising, but I also spent so much time aimlessly wandering around Planet Mira, and it adds up. I have 136 hours in the game, and I adored every second of it. Right from the first time I saw it in a Nintendo Direct, I fell in love with the game. The gameplay confused me at first, but once it clicked, I got super into build crafting, arts management, gear optimization, and most of all, scale customization. I'm sure I spent hours just fine-tuning the colors on all of my mechs, and while the story is easily the weakest of the Xenoblade games, the sheer joy of flying above that world in a Skell is absolutely unmatched. And it's a crime that this game hasn't hit Switch. Xenoblade X is the pinnacle of the Wii U for me, and a game I highly recommend everybody play by any means necessary. Then, of course, Breath of the Wild. Across multiple saves, I have around 290 to 300 hours. I believe about 230 of those came from my initial launch day save file, around 35 from my most recent Master Mode playthrough for the retrospective, and the rest are from various one-offs and unfinished runs, Ganon-only run, and some just files that I made for footage. I have talked about the game extensively before, so it's obvious why I've spent that kind of time in the game, so if you haven't heard my thoughts already, go check out the video. The last game in this open world click is The Witcher 3 at 103 hours, plus 20 on a separate PS4 save. But it's really nothing about the open world that kept me here so long. It's gorgeous and interesting, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't lend itself to natural, immersive exploration the way Breath of the Wild does. No, the reason I dumped so much time into this game is the story. The main campaign itself can be somewhere between 50 to 80 hours long, and then there's all of the side stories, which are all noteworthy and interesting to play through. Add the DLC on top, and I have hardly scratched the surface of all of the interesting content on offer in that game. The atmosphere of the world is also incredibly enthralling, which is the other major factor pulling away all that time from me. With the next-gen update having launched recently, I expect I'll be jumping back into the game at least for a little bit, so surely that number will rise as well. The last game I've spent over 100 hours on is Xenoblade Chronicles 2 at 145. The main campaign took me 80 hours roughly, and then the 30-hour DLC on top easily passes the threshold here. Obviously, I enjoyed the game enough to put that initial time in, and the world and its characters are endearing and intriguing, and the gameplay is great too, so it all makes sense. There is really nothing especially profound for me to note on this one though. It is just a delightful game, one that I was enamored enough by to spend a lovely 145 hours in. It's a great game to escape to. Now that we've more or less talked about every game I have played for at least 100 hours, I want to take a look at some of the patterns present here. Compiling this list has been very interesting to me for a number of reasons, but especially because it illuminated some of my playing habits. I knew going into this that portable play was going to be a major factor in this list. I have played the Switch more than any other console I've owned by a huge margin, and probably all of them combined, frankly. I've hit 100 hours in more games on Switch than any of the other platforms I've ever played. I also knew that my friend group's mainstay multiplayer titles would occupy a fair portion of this list, but something I didn't expect to find was that significantly more of the titles on this list were games I played in or after high school. In my head, I have this perception that I had infinitely more time when I was a little kid. I think this comes from the fact that I played Pokemon Platinum and Skyward Sword a ridiculous amount of times. I have drawn out 30-hour games to more than triple their length. There's no way I could do that now. But the thing is, I'm playing way more games than I used to. In 2021, I beat 33 games. And while I was definitely on a slower pace last year, in high school, I was lucky if I played through even 10 games in a year. But before high school, whatever I happened to get for Christmas and my birthday, that's what I played for the whole year. This is something that holds true in all areas of my life, but the more I actually do, the more it feels like I'm doing less. Because while I am playing more games than ever, I'm also buying more games than ever, and I can't tear through my backlog as fast as I build it. I'm also far more aware of all the games coming out than I used to be, so even if I don't own a game, it is still sitting in the back of my head as something I'd like to play in a little mental wish list. A second backlog. As I do more and tackle more that I want to be doing, my ambitions grow higher. And so even though I'm playing more games, it is such a small percentage of the games I want to be playing. Whereas the 2 or 3 games I played in a year when I was little was 100% of that list. But this is a little bit of a tangent, so let's get back to the patterns here. I knew multiplayer games would occupy a big seat on this list, but I was surprised to see that only one single-player game from my PC library was here. The only single-player games here are from Nintendo, barring Stardew and The Witcher. I'm not sure if this is a testament to the timeless longevity of their games or just a reflection of my bias towards them, but interesting nonetheless. Another interesting tidbit here is that I didn't expect how many multiplayer games are on here that I played just by myself. Most of my time in Rocket League, both Splatoons, both versions of Smash 4, and Smash Ultimate, was almost entirely spent by me just solo grinding. Obviously, as I said earlier, these games are built for this and it makes sense, but just based on my own flawed perception of my own taste, I didn't expect to have played so much of these repetitive games. What's more, those games actually outnumber the games I've played alongside my friends. Now, that said, the amount of time I've spent playing games with my friends completely dwarfs everything else on the list. Ultimately, there is a common thread amongst all of these games. Minecraft, Monster Hunter, Sea of Thieves, Breath of the Wild, Animal Crossing, these are all games I return to when I feel stuck or burnt out or like I just need a break. They're familiar, comfortable, welcoming. They offer me a haven where I know I'll enjoy myself when I sit down to play them. But you didn't need me to tell you that. A lot of people play video games primarily for that escapism. That isn't new or revolutionary, and frankly, it's probably not even interesting at this point. And while I have logical explanations for why I've played these specific games for so long, I don't have a good explanation for why other similar games didn't make the list. There's a lot of games that I play with my friends that aren't on here. Lots of games with great stories or worlds, lots of multiplayer games with fun mechanics that just didn't make it. A lot of it comes down to time and place. If I played Fire Emblem Awakening for the first time this year, it would have been played once, I would have loved it, but then I would have shelved it. All of these games are here because they hit me at exactly the right time. They were the perfect escape when I needed one. But just because they live fondly in my memories for the dozens of hours spent in their worlds, doesn't mean I think they're more valuable than games I've spent less time with. But what about you? What are some of the games that you've played for over 100 hours? Is that a lot of time to you? Is that kind of pathetic to you? What is your most played game? I'd love to hear from you. Let me know down in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. You might be able to hear my pipes in the background, so sorry for that. But I just wanted to give a quick thank you. I feel like I do this pretty often, but thank you to everybody who's been following and supporting the channel lately. I apologize, I haven't gotten any content out in a minute. I've been in London, so I've got some pretty exciting stuff on the fire. Got a couple of interesting proper video essay ideas that I have that I'm writing scripts for. Hopefully that are exciting to you all as much as they are to me. I also want to say thank you for your patience with this 3-part video series. It's kind of stopped being that. I initially conceived this project last July, and it has taken significantly longer to put out than what I expected, and the kind of goal of it, I suppose, has changed. This was originally was supposed to be a set of 3 episodes of the Skyward game show that would debut kind of closely together and be a fun little triplet of things. And as I was talking about in the video, my ambitions for it have just grown exponentially, and especially with the last episode of the show. I think I've decided that I want the show to be something a little bit different, so I'm releasing this video not as an episode of the Skyward game show like I had intended. I don't know if that matters to anybody, but I just kind of wanted to put that out there. So, thanks for watching. See you in the next one.